All right, Shabbat, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan. Stephen Teri Czinn for dedicating all the Shimon Joshels this month with gratitude to Hashem as they welcome their fifth grandchild, Gavriel Amichai Czinn, and in memory of Steve's mother, Doris Czinn, Devorah Bas Rabbi Yisroel Yoel Shaindy and Avraham Kelman for dedicating all the Shimon Joshels this month, the commemoration of the yahrzeit of Avram's father, Rephael Yechiel ben Avram, Mr. Jerome Kelman, and our week of learning sponsors, Hilary Jacobson Kent, in memory of her daughter, Shifra Bas Chana Dena. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, we should continue to see Nisim v'niflaos for all of Klal Yisrael, Besoros Tovos, all of Klal Yisrael, all of our hostages returned home, our soldiers safe and successful, and Shalom for Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Kuf Gimel 103, and we are picking up in Metzia Hashem on 102b, Kuf Beis Amud Beis. Mi Amar Shmuel, so which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 lines up from the bottom. So Gemara says as follows: Mi Amar Shmuel lo Amrin Tafas Lashon Achron. So it says, remember again, we had a really interesting Mishnah in yesterday's daf about rental agreements. And I'm sorry, and I forgot, and in Mazel Tov to Ari and Shoshana Lerner on the engagement of their son Yonah, to Tamima. What's Tamima's last name, Ari? Gavei, Tamima Gavei, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Again, in Meretz Hashem, the young couple should be zocha to build the Bayis Hashem Yisrael. They should be zocha to go to the Chuppah b'Sha'a Tova u'Metzlachos. And in Meretz Hashem, Aaron Shoshan should be gebenched with many years and many generations of beautiful Yiddish Nachas. Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. All right, suppose the coffee tastes extra good this morning. That's the simcha. That's the sweetness of the simcha in it. So remember again, we were speaking in the Mishnah yesterday about rental agreements, and specifically again, the distinction between monthly agreements versus yearly agreements, specifically in the area of a leap year, about who gets the benefit of that extra month in a situation of a leap year like that. So remember again, so Shmuel came along, and Shmuel wanted to suggest that, or I should say really Rav came along and suggested that really this whole thing is, then the Gemara brought up a case, okay, I'm sorry, let me be clear. Gemara brought up a case where a person framed the rental agreement both in terms of a yearly agreement and then a monthly agreement. So what do we do in a situation like that? So this brought up the interesting discussion of what we call Tafas Lashon Acharon, which literally means when a person makes two statements, both of them are contradictory statements. So which statement do we seize? So we had this concept of Tafas Lashon Acharon that simply go ahead and seize on the last statement made. So the Gemara says, the Shmuel not hold of that. The Shmuel not hold of Tafas Lashon Acharon. V'ha Rabbi Shmuel Silber tarvayu kor b'shloshim ani mocher l'cha. So this is an interesting halacha. I go over to Reuven. I say, Reuven, I am selling you a core of produce for 30 zuz. Right? Let's say core, which is right, core produce for 30 zuz. What's the halacha? So here's what's interesting about this. Because of the way I'm framing the transaction is I'm selling you a core, therefore the transaction is not complete until the full core is measured out. Because of that, if I choose to go ahead and retract, if I choose to go ahead and renege on the agreement, I can do that until the complete core is measured out. Afilu b'sachrona, core b'shloshim sa'ah. Kor b'shloshim sa'ah b'sa'ah ani mocher l'cha. I will say, what happens if I say to Reuven, I'm selling you a core for 30 zuz, and each sa'ah is a selah. So here, the way I frame this is the total amount of the transaction is going to be a core, but then I broke it down that each sa'ah is for a selah. And what's the halacha? Rishon kana. So in that case, again, as I'm measuring out each sa'ah, Reuven acquires that son. I can no longer renege on that. What do you see from here? You see from here, Tafas Lashon Acharon, that go ahead and seize upon the last statement made. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam taimamai mishum de Tafas. Hachanami de Tafas. So the Gemara says, no. So what's the reason over there? The reason over there is Hasam time of mine, Mishum the Tafis, because it will say we go after the last statement that was made. Hachanami Katafis. Good. Rav Nachman says, Karka becheskas ba'alea kayemes. Shabbos said this is actually very interesting. Rav Nachman comes along, and Rav Nachman says that first of all, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Hasam, second wide line in Rashi, Hasam Mishum the Tafisu, or the Olam Mesapkele Lishmuel, Hilchach Nami Tafis, Ein Barakach Lahotzi Miyado, Ha'emed David Al Cheskaso. So as I say, the idea over here is that Shmuel holds of it, but Shmuel holds of it more misafek, because we're not sure. Therefore, again, by definition, almost like the default is go after the last statement that was made. Okay, Rav Nachman comes along. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman Amar, Karka becheskas ba'aleha kayamas. So look at Rashi. Rav Nachman Amar, Karka becheskas ba'aleha omeres, va'afilu ba besof ha'chodesh. Shabbos said, if you remember again, and yes, we have to reference back a little bit to yesterday's daf. If you remember again, yesterday's daf, we had this idea that, let's say we have a leap year, right? I rent Ruvain the field for the entire year. And now what happens? The leap month comes along. So the Gemara made this interesting distinction about when the claim is made. If the claim is made at the beginning of the month, so the law sides with the landlord. If the claim is made at the end of the month, ultimately again, then the law sides with the renter. And if the claim is made in the middle of the month, then what's the halacha? Yachloku. So now comes along Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman Amar, Karka becheskas ba'alea kayemes. Karka, in general land, stands with the chazaka of the owner. Now look at Rashi. What does that mean? Rav Nachman Amar, Karka becheskas ba'alea omeres, va'afilu ba b'sof hachodesh kulo lemaskir. The truth is, even if the landlord comes at the end of the month, the landlord is entitled to rent for that leap month. Why? Sha'asafek lo achshav nolad, ela mitchilas hachodesh nolad. Well, say it's not the pshat that the suffix was suddenly born now, right? The suffix was already present from the beginning of the month. Ve'emid karka al cheskaso, and go ahead and establish karka on its chazaka. The chazaka is that who owns it? Who owns the karka? Right? The owner owns the karka. The landlord owns the karka. So Rav Nachman comes along and says, no. We'll say in this case. Now remember again, all of this is this case of where there's this double lashon, right? Of a yearly rental and a monthly rental. So Rav Nachman says it doesn't matter. You're showing up beginning of the month, end of the month, middle of the month. Makes no difference. The karka is in the chazaka of the landlord. Therefore, again, the landlord is the owner, and therefore, again, when in doubt, the landlord is the one who should receive the money. That's the logic. So the Gemara goes weiter. So my kamash malon. So what is Rav Nachman teaching us? Tafas lashon achron hanu derav. So I'll say so. It sounds like again Rav Nachman saying the same thing. Tafas lashon achron. Because remember again, what do we have over here? The nature of this rental agreement in question is, I say to Reuven, I'm renting you my field, I'm renting you my house, whatever it is, for a year, for 12,000 zuz, and for a month for 1,000 zuz, or for argument's sake. So again, Rav Nachman's coming along and saying, it doesn't really matter when we show up in the Beis Din, whether we show up beginning of the month, middle of the month, end of the month. So I am the owner, the chazaka is with me, therefore when in doubt, I'm entitled to extra rent for that month. The Gemara says, okay, so Rav Nachman, you're saying the same thing as Rav. Rav also agreed with this, just Rav framed this as saying Tafas Lashon Achron. Since the last statement that was made was ultimately a statement of a monthly rental, therefore go bust a monthly rental, to which the Gemara says, no, Afagav da'apiv meifach. That's not true. Because according to Rav Nachman would say this even if for argument's sake, you first phrased it as a monthly agreement and then phrased it as a yearly agreement. Rav Nachman would still say that the landlord is entitled to rent for the extra month. Okay, incredible. Let's go back to Boimanim Rabbi Yanai. Socher Amar Nasati Umaskir Amar Lo Natalti Amila Haviraya. So we'll say this is very interesting. They asked the following question to Rabbi Yanai. So the following scenario: the renter says, "I paid the rent." The landlord said, "I didn't get the rent. I didn't receive any payment." So we'll say, "So what's the halacha? Amila Haviraya." Who is responsible here? In other words, upon whom does the burden of proof rest? So the Gemara says, well, let's look. Emas, when is this occurring? Ibisok zmano. So I will say, if, right, it's tanina. Ila achar zmano tanina. Now I will say, now here's what's interesting. When is this occurring? If it's occurring during the rental duration, right, during the rental period, then we've learned it. If it's happened after the rental period, then we learned it. Now, where have we learned it? It's actually an interesting raya. This nan. Meisa'av b'soch shloshim yom b'cheskas shalom nifta. So let's listen to this. There's a mitzvah pidyon haben. The mitzvah pidyon haben is that a father is obligated to redeem his firstborn child at 30 days. So what happens if chas v'shalom the father dies during the 30 days? So the Gemara says, Meisa'av b'soch shloshim yom b'cheskas shalom nifta. If the father dies within 30 days, and the chazaka is that the child is unredeemed. So the Gemara says, unless, of course, there's some proof that's brought that the father arranged for the redemption before his death. What happens if the father died after 30 days? Then the chazaka is that the child was redeemed. Ultimately, again, until you bring a raya that the child wasn't redeemed. So we'll say, so what do you see from there? What you see from there is that before something becomes due, we assume that the obligation has not been satisfied. But once it's become due, then we assume it has been satisfied. So remember again, the Gemara is operating under the assumption over here that rent is paid at the end of the month. At the end of the month, right? So l'maisa, it should depend when this is coming up. If it's coming up during the month, then we assume that the borrower didn't pay his rent yet. If it's coming up at the end of the month, then we should assume that the borrower did pay his rent. To which the Gemara says something very interesting. Lo tzricha biyoma d'mishalim zmanei. So we'll say this is very interesting. No. Where is this coming up? On the last day of the month. The last day of the month. So we'll say, what's the shayla? Mi avid inish de para biyom de mishalim zmanei olo. So we'll say essentially what the Gemara is, what's the shayla over here? Do people pay their bills on time? Right? That's the shayla. In other words, is it common for the renter to go ahead and pay his rent mamish on the last day of the month, or maybe he pays whatever the next day? And again, that's okay because just common practice is that's still considered to be on time, right? Such a fascinating shayla. So the Gemara says, look at Rashi, lo tzricha shetavale biyomei d'mishalim zmanei les Rashi v'hu omer lo nasativ baboker. So I will say what's interesting about this is as follows. So what's happening over here? So the landlord is coming to the renter. He's saying, "You owe me rent. You owe me rent." So right. So the renter is saying, "I paid you in the morning. I paid you in the morning already." Right. So again, the landlord is saying, "No, you didn't." So halacha l'maisa, what happens under those circumstances? So is it common? Do we say that people normally pay on the day that the rental period is over or not? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says we learned this. Where do we learn this? So we'll say top of Kuf Gimel 103a. Right, we learn this. Sacher bismano nishba v'notel. So we'll say this is actually an interesting case. A renter in his time, right, at the right time, goes ahead and takes a shvua and then takes the item. Now what is this talking about? Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Top Rashi, Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph. Sacher bismano nishba v'notel. In biyom sheyatza mimalachto Tavo, nishba shelo kibel v'notel. So we'll say it's very interesting. So now this is talking about a hired worker. So if a hired worker, right, finishes his job, and biyom sheyatza mimalachto Tavo, so we'll say, so what happens? So now the employee, the worker, goes to his employer. He says, pay me. The employer says, I paid you. So the employee says, no, you didn't. So what does he do? He swears that he did not receive payment, the notel, and then he gets paid. Mishlan the Balabayis Tarbib Halav, so now watch this. So now here you have an interesting case. So I employ Ruvain. Ruvain finished his job. He comes to me for payment. I claim I paid you. He claims no, you didn't. So what's the halacha? He swears that he did not get paid, and I pay him. So the Gemara says, so Sacher Bismano Nishba V'Notel. So we'll say, so what's interesting about this is, it would appear based on this, that it's not common for people to pay on time, right? Otherwise, again, the halacha would side with me that I have already paid my employee. The fact that the halacha says that Reuven the employee swears that he did not get paid, and then I, the employer, go ahead and pay him, would seem to indicate that people don't normally pay on time. If that's the case, then back to the case of the renter, we should assume that the renter did not pay his rent on the last day of the month. To which the Gemara says, no, this is a different case. Sachir hu d'ramu rabbanon shvua alei mishum da balabayis tarad b'pa'alav. Both say the case of the employee is different. What are we concerned about over here? It's not that I am purposely lying as the employer, right? It's not that I'm purposely lying and saying that I paid Reuven when I know that I didn't. Rather, what's happening over here? What's happening over here is I'm managing a business, right? And I have a bunch of employees. So the concern over here is that maybe I'm so immersed in the details of what's going on that I forgot that I didn't pay Reuven. Aval hacha socher mehemen b'shvua. But I will say over here, in the case of the rent, right, so that's why in general, again, we assume that maybe I neglected to pay my employee on time, because halacha l'maisa, again, I'm just involved in all the other details of my business. But again, in the case of the renter, we assume that people do in fact go ahead and pay on time, and therefore, again, the renter has the ability to go ahead and take a shvua that he paid on time and fills his obligation. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, Hayman. So therefore, we'll say, interestingly enough, in this particular case over here, where halacha l'maisa, again, renter shows up and says, I paid my rent, right? So landlord says, no, you didn't. So assuming we're talking about at the end of the month, the halacha is renter takes a shvua that he paid on time, and that's it. That's the end of the case. All right, very interesting. So Amar Rav Nachman, Hayman da'ogir lebeis lechavre le'eser shnin. But it's an interesting case here. I rent my house to Reuven for 10 years. For 10 years, because of late shtara. And ultimately, again, we write a shtar. So now what happens? So right, that's the shtar says. I Silber, rented Reuven a house for 10 years. Okay. So now, va'amrle nakit chamish shnin. They both say, I come back and then I say, Reuven, by the way, you've already lived there for 5 years. Now, obviously, we have to be talking about a case where there's no date in the shtar, right? Because if there's a date, obviously, again, this is measurable. So there's no date in the shtar for whatever the reason. And I come back and I claim in front of Beis and Reuven, I just want to make sure that you know you already lived there for 5 years. Now, obviously, Reuven's contesting this. Reuven's saying, no, I only lived there for 3 years. So I'm going to back on me difti ravina. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Va'amrle nakit chamis shnin mehemen. I am believed. I, the landlord, am believed. Rashi says, mehemen, balabayis the karka bechaskas bala omedes, I'll call davar safek abala fanenu. Now, both say. Now, what's interesting is, this seems to be an extension of what we were learning before. In general, again, both say, the karka, right, karka, the chazak of karka is that it resides with who? With the owner. Now, which makes sense. I own it. And in this case, again, ownership is not being contested. Reuven agrees that I own it. Right? What's happened over here is I've rented it to Reuven for 10 years. So because I, the owner, have the chazaka, therefore in any case of doubt that comes up, I have the ability to go ahead, I am believed to clarify that doubt. So therefore, again, if in this case over here, I have a shtar that says, I rented Reuven the land for 10 years. There's no date in the shtar. I show up in Beis and I say, Reuven, you've already lived there for 5 years. Reuven says, no, I haven't. I've only lived here for 3 years. Who's believed? I, the owner of the land, am believed. Because since I'm the owner, the chazaka, right? It's even more about it, because generally chazaka is presumption, right? Presumption of ownership. Here it's not even a presumption of ownership. I am the owner. And because I am the owner, therefore I am vested with the halachic right to clarify ambiguous situations. That's the halacha. We keep seeing the same concept over and over and over. So Ravacha of Difti said to Ravina, if that's the case, al me'ata Osfa me'azuze b'shtara. So we'll say if that's the case, Ravina said you could really, this would seem to lead to a little bit of a strange reality. Listen to this. Let's say I lend Ruvain 100 zuz in a shtar. Va'amalei paraticha palga, and Ruvain says, I paid back half already. I paid back half. Hachanami de mehemin. So should Ruvain be believed? In other words, I will say, since there's a shtar, in other words, we seem to be saying over here that when you have a shtar, so ultimately, again, the party to the shtar, the dominant party in the shtar, ultimately, again, has the ability to qualify the realities of the shtar. So if that's the case over here, if I lend Ruvain $100, does Ruvain have a right to say, by the way, I already paid you back 50? Would he be believed in such a case? Or no. Hachi hashta hasam shtar legovaina kai. We'll say it's a very different case. In the case of a loan, the entire purpose of a loan document is for what purpose? Collection. Therefore, again, I will say, Im isa de pare I baile lemichtav agve. So we'll say, so in other words, if halacha l'maisa, Reuven had really paid back half of the loan, then what? Then that should have been written. Right? They should have rewritten the document. Inami michtav alei tavra, or he should have gotten some kind of receipt. Aval hacha amar le, Rabbi say in the case for the prolonged rental, aval hacha amar le haydich sivu l'chashtara ki hechi lo tachzik alei. So Rabbi says, see, here's what's interesting. In the case of a loan document, if it was true that the borrower paid back part of the debt, then what? Then the borrower certainly would make sure that either a new document was written or at least a receipt was issued. In this case over here of the prolonged rental, so again I will say what's the whole role of the document? The whole of the document is if I'm renting my field or my house to move in for 10 years, what am I most concerned about? That since Reuben's going to be living there for a prolonged amount of time, I do not want him to assert ownership. That's what I'm most concerned about in this scenario. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, the role of the document is to prevent Reuven from making any claim of ownership in this situation. So therefore, again, that's the role of that document. And that's the sole role of that document. So because of that, I, the owner, am believed to qualify the nature of that document as well. So if I show up in Beis Din, and I say, Reuven, you've already lived there for 5 years, and Reuven says, no, I've only lived here for 3 years, I, the owner of the land, are believed to clarify the reality of that document. Incredible. So Amar Rav Nachman, Shol Adam B'Tuval the Olam. All right, so this is a very interesting case. So look right across in Rashi. Shol Adam B'Tuval the Olam. Rashi says, Imra Adam Kli Chavero. Imra Adam Kli Lechavero. Va'amar Hashilani B'Tuvo. So we'll say, now listen to this. I go over to Reuven. I see that Reuven has an object, and I say to Reuven this lashon, Hashileni bituvo. Literally, lend me this item as long as it's usable. Bituvo means as long as it's good. So lend me this object, lend me this item as long as it is usable. Va'amar lehein sha'olo, right? Sha'olo liolam. And Reuven says, sure, no problem. Then what's talacha? The object is lent to me liolam, forever. In other words, this lashon of lend me something bituvo, or right bituvo, as long as it's good, means let me borrow it as long as it is usable. So halacha l'maisa, if Reuven agrees to this, then I have the right to borrow it, literally again as long as it's usable. Finish Rashi. Calls mashurai l'malacha dahai bituvo mashmalon kolsman shehu tov tuvo afilu machziro chozer v'not lo kisheisar. And I will say, now here's what's interesting. Now here's the real kunz of this case. So if I go over to Reuven and say, Reuven, lend me this object, bituvo. Bituvo means as long as it is usable. Now, as long as it's usable essentially means as long as it's functional. Now, what's the chiddush? So I borrowed this from Reuven today on Monday. I give it back to Reuven in 3 weeks from now. I have the right to take it back, so to speak, right? Again, in other words, this idea of borrowing it bituvo means I have the right to use it as long as it's usable, borrow it as long as it's usable, and even if I return it to Reuven, I have the right to take it again. Right? That's the chap of this arrangement over here. So Amar Amari Brei de Bashmuel, V'hu dekanu minei. Now obviously this is only going to work assuming that we made a secondary kinyan. Now what does this mean? Generally when you borrow something, we had this before, when you borrow something, how do you acquire the item that you're borrowing? How do you acquire it? Mashicha. Now I will say, so generally, if you're acquiring a borrowed item through Mashiach, so the duration of that borrowing, of that she'ila, only lasts until when you give back the object. Because once you give back the object, your act of Mashiach has effectively come to an end. So I'll say, in this kind of case where you are borrowing an object, bituvo, right, for as long as it's usable, it's true. You can take it, borrow it, give it back, take it again, but you must have done a secondary kinyan. Like, for example, going back to our previous sentence, like a kinyan chalipin, right, or a kinyan sudar. Some additional kinyan independent of Mashiach that would allow you to go ahead and use and reuse the object for a prolonged amount of time. All right, interesting. Amar Rav Mari Braid Ravashi, or Mahader Le Kasye, or Kate. So what's a Kasye? So what's now listen to this. Now here's what's interesting is, now in this kind of case, you're allowed to use the object as long as it's usable. Let's say you went ahead and mamish, you used it up to the point that all that's left of it is the handle, right? You mamish got your borrowing worth out of it. So in that case, you have to return the handle to the owner. Rashi says, Daha lav b'matani yave el she'ilahavi ubetuvahavi hu bahai lo tovu. So so the idea over here is I have a right to use the object until it's no longer usable, but once it's quote unquote used up, I have an obligation to return the pieces, or in this case, return the handle. All right, incredible. Amarava, Haiman da'amalei lechavre, Oshlan mara lemirpak be hai pardesa, Rapak be'ahu pardesa. But if I borrow a shovel from Ruvain, and I say to Ruvain, I'm borrowing the shovel to go ahead and dig in this orchard. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Now, in this case over here, I'm specifying the orchard that I'm going to be, or the garden that I'm going to be shoveling in. Then the halacha is, I'm allowed to use the shovel in this orchard, and not in another. So Rabbi Be'ahu Pardesa. Let's say again, I just generally, I say to Ruvain, I'm borrowing a shovel to use in an orchard. So then again, I will say the halacha is, so Pardesa, Rabbi Be'ahu Pardesa, then you could use in any orchard you want. So what the Gemara is highlighting over here is, the way you go ahead and frame the act of borrowing dictates the manner of usage. So therefore, if I go to the Ruvain and say, Ruvain, I'm borrowing the shovel to dig in this orchard, then I'm limited to using it in this orchard. If I go ahead and say I'm borrowing a shovel to use in an orchard, then what? I can use it in any orchard I want. So the Gemara says, Pardisoi, Rapik Va'azul Kol Pardisoi de Islay Mahadalai Kasye. If I say I'm using it to shovel in orchards, plural, then what? I can use it in as many orchards that I want, even to the point if I use up the shovel disintegrates and all I have left is the handle, I can give that back to the owner. Okay. Amar Papa, Haiman da Amar Lechavre, Oshlan ha Gargusa, Benafla lo Banile. So we'll say this is an interesting case. If I go ahead and I say to Ruvain, I want to borrow your well. Rashi says over here, Oshlan hashilini gargusa be'ermayim chaim lahashkos sodos. So we'll say, so in this case over here, Ruvain has a well, and I want to borrow that well to go ahead and water my fields. So we'll say, and then what happens? The well collapses. So the halacha is lo bani lei. Ultimately, again, I'm borrowing the well from Ruvain, right? Ruvain has a well, I'm borrowing the well to go ahead and water my field. The well collapses. I don't have a right to rebuild the well. Rashi says, lo bani lei, in badlib noso v'lomar lo od sha'oli li'olam zema akev ala va'omer lo hishalticha ela oso v'lo kishnasa achar. So I don't have a right, an automatic right to rebuild the well. Why? Because what could Ruvain say? Ruvain said, listen, I lent you that well. That well no longer exists, and therefore, again, I'm not giving you the right to rebuild it. Now, I'll say, obviously, if Ruvain gives me the right to rebuild it, of course I can. But the Gemara is pointing out over here is that the right to rebuild is not automatic. Next, Gargusa v'nafla, banila. Now, we'll say, case number one was, I borrowed from Ruvain this well. So therefore, again, if this well collapses, I don't have an automatic right to rebuild it. Let's say I borrowed from Ruvain a well, right? I borrowed v'nafla, V'nafla, banila, then I have the right to go ahead and rebuild it. Because again, I rented from the right to a well. The fact that this one collapsed, okay, now I have the right to go ahead and rebuild it. Be gargusa. If I go ahead, I will say, Rashi says over Be gargusa means Amar lo b'lashon hazeh Hashim Be gargusa Hashim makom lachbar bo ba'er kamerlei. I will say now, if I rent from Reuven the right to dig a well, right, the right to create a well. So in other words, essentially what's happening over here is Reuven has a field, and I'm renting from him or borrowing from him the right, or getting from him the right to dig a well. So what's talacha? Kari va'azul kama gargusi ba'ari ademisramile. So in that case, I could dig as much as I need to on his field until I'm able to go ahead and find a well that provides for my agricultural needs. But I will say in this kind of case, there needs to also be a separate, independent type of king. In other words, I will say, see, in the previous cases, we were dealing with a defined well. In this case over here, last case, really what I'm acquiring from Reuven is the right to dig a well on his property. So because of that, halacha l'maisa, again, I need to do a separate, independent kinyan with him to acquire that right. Okay, incredible. But the last mission of the parak. Hamaskir bayis lechavero b'nafal. But a very interesting case. I rent a house to Reuven. And the house that I rented him collapses. So what's halacha? Chayiv lahamid lo. I have an obligation to give him another home. So again, in other words, we'll say, so I rented Reuven a home for a year, or whatever, for 5 years. Let's go for 5 years. Then what happens? Then year number 2, the home collapses. I have an obligation to provide him another home in fulfillment of the rental agreement. Haya katan lo yase godol, godol lo yase katan. Furthermore, again, I will say, I have an obligation to furnish him with the same type of home that I rented him from the outset. So if it was a small house, I can't rebuild a big house. If it was a big house, I can't rebuild a small house. So if it was a one-room house, right, or one-family house, I can't make it into a two-room or a two-family house. Or if it was a two-room or two-family, I can't make it into one. You cannot rebuild it with fewer windows. Nor should you make it with more windows, unless, of course, they both consent. So we'll say, so there's 2 halachas over here. Halacha number 1 is, if I rent Reuven a home, and then the home collapses during the duration of the rental, I have an obligation to furnish Reuven with a new home. That's halacha with a replacement home. That's halacha number 1. Halacha number 2 is, the replacement home must be the same type of home as the original rental home. And the only time that there's an ability to go ahead and build something new is when? Is if halacha l'maisa, both landlord and renter agree to a change in the rental. Okay, incredible. Says the Gemara, Hechi Dami, what's the case? Ida Amalei Bayis Zeh. So Bo says, now the Gemara wants to understand, what's the case of where as a landlord, I am obligated to furnish Reuven with another home. So if I said to Reuven, I'm renting you this house, then what's the halacha? Nafal azulei. It will say, if I say to Reuven, I rented you this house means what? What does this house mean? This house means this house. And therefore, if this house collapses, then what is my obligation? I don't have one. I'm done. Both say similar to the case of when I rent Reuven this well. What happens if the well collapses? We're done. So the Gemara says, Ida Amalei Bayis Stam. So I'll say, and if I just said to Reuven in general, right, Reuven, I'm renting you a home, and totally non-specific, then Echad Amay Lo Yasenu Shnayim. Katan Amay Lo Yasenu Gadol. So we'll say, if I just rented Reuven a house Stam, right, just a house, without any type of specifications, then when the house falls down, it's true. I have to furnish him with another home, but I should be able to rebuild that new home however I want. I want to make it bigger, I want to make it smaller, more windows, less windows. That's my right. So what's going on over here? Reish Lakish, what's the case? The Amrli Bayis Shani Maskir Lecha Midas Arko Kach V'Kach. So I will say this is interesting. The case over here is where I rented Reuven a home, and I gave Reuven the dimensions of the home I'm renting him. So I'm renting you a home that's 2,000 square feet. 2,000 square feet, that's what I'm renting you. So the Gemara says, "Ihaki ma'ila memra." So we'll say, so I don't understand. So that's a case where there's specificity. Eliki also Rav and Amar Reish Lakish to Amar Lei Bayis Kazeh Ani Maskir Lecha. So again, Rav came along and said Reish Lakish, when I say to Reuven, I'm renting you this type of home. So the Gemara says, "Va'akati ma'ila memra." So again, I will say, when we're being so specific, I don't understand what is there to say. Listen to this. The kai aguda dinara. So we'll say, what's the case? The case is where the home that I rented to Reuven is a 2,000 square foot house, with 2 stories and 4 bedrooms sitting on the banks of the river. Mal de tema. So we'll say, so I say to Reuven, I'm renting you this kind of house. So mal de tema, my kazeh, the kai aguda dinara. See, I will say, I would have thought like this. Let's say, so here, the case is like this. I say to Reuven, right, I have a house that's 2,000 square feet with 4 bedrooms on 2 floors sitting on waterfront property, right, on the banks of the river. And I say to Reuven, I'm renting you a house like this. Okay? Now Reuven goes into the house, then what happens? The house collapses. So now, as a landlord, I have an obligation to furnish Reuven another home. I would have thought that at the end of the day, what does it mean when I said to Reuven, I'm giving you this kind of house? What's the this? Waterfrant property. Maybe that's the ikar. And really, again, how many square feet and how many bedrooms and how many floors, that really doesn't matter. Kamash Malon, no. That when you say kazeh means like all the specifics of this initial home. So I am renting Reuven, yes, a waterfront property home on 2 floors with 2,000 square feet and 4 bedrooms, and therefore, again, when the house falls down, that's the exact type of house that I am obligated to finish. Which I will say something very interesting, which tells you that in halacha, when you are going ahead and renting someone a home, it almost seems like from the landlord's perspective, the best thing is to do what? Say, bayis zeh. That way, again, your responsibility is limited mamish to this particular home, and should something happen, you would not be responsible anymore. Okay, Rabbi say Hajjan Allah Hashoel Mazel Tov, brand new parak. Hamakabel Sodom Mechavero. So we'll say very interesting case here. So I go ahead and I receive a field from Reuven. Now, what does it mean I receive a field? I'm working the field. We'll say, take a look at the first Rashi, all the way on the bottom of the daf. Hamakabel o ba'arisos lemechzo u'shlish u'lerevia o b'chachirus b'kach v'kach kurum l'shana. So we'll say Rashi over here highlights that there are essentially two types of we'll call it like profit sharing or sharecropping agreements. There's what's called an aris. Now, typically we go ahead and we translate aris as a sharecropper. How does a sharecropper work? Right, Reuven has a field. He's the owner. I come to work the field, and the way it works is I agree to pay Reuven a specific percentage of the yield of the crop. So whatever the percentage is. So again, my obligation to Reuven is to pay a percentage of the crop, and therefore, again, I will say the good news for me is, therefore, I'm really never out of pocket, because again, my rental agreement is a percentage of crop, as opposed to chachirus. So chachirus, I will say chachirus. Ultimately, also it also translates as sharecropping, but really, I will say what it is Reuven gets a guaranteed amount of produce per year. So let's say, for example, he's going to get 10 core of produce. Now, I, the farmer, am obligated to pay him that no matter what the yield of the field is. So I will say in arisos, as in aris, Reuven is always getting a percentage. So whatever the yield is, he's going to get a percentage of that. So he yields a lot, he yields a little, his percentage is going to be the same. In chachirus, I will say, I am on the hook for a specific amount of produce. So therefore, again, if the field does not have a good year, I'm out of pocket in giving Reuven that additional amount of produce. Okay, so now we'll get more into this in the coming parak. So therefore, again, I receive a field from Reuven. Now, whether this is arisos or chachirus, either way, makom shenagul liktzar, yiktzar, lak or yakor. So it's an interesting case for you. Now, apparently, when harvesting a field, there are two different ways to go and harvest the field. You could do what's called ktsira, which means you take a sickle and you just go ahead and cut down the wheat. Or you could do akira, which means you pull the wheat out of the ground. What's an nafkamina? When you pull the wheat out of the ground, there's nothing left in the ground anymore. When you do ktsira, when you use the sickle, so the bottom stalks, right? The bottom stalks are still left there in the ground. So the Mishnah says over here, everything follows minhag hamakom. So as the worker, I'm allowed to follow minhag hamakom. So if the minhag is to go ahead and do ktsira, I do ktsira. If the minhag is to do akira, I do akira. Lachrosh acharav yachrosh, where the custom is to plow the field after harvest season. So we'll see sometimes what they would do is they would harvest and then they would plow. When that is the minhag, then that's what you should do. Akol k'minhag haMedina. Everything goes after the minhag haMedina. We'll say so again. So local custom. Kishem shecholkim b'tfuah, kach cholkim b'tevin or b'kash. The same way that the sharecropper and the owner split in the tfuah in the grain, they also split the straw and the stubble. And the same way, again, if we're talking about a vineyard, so ultimately the sharecropper and the owner split the wine. So too, again, they split. Ultimately, again, are the Rashi says these are the shoots that come off the vines. Ubekanim. So we're going to see kanim are actually again the poles. So remember again, vines. If you go to vineyards, right? So vines are draped like along poles. So those poles that keep the vines upright, those are called the kanim. Ushneim mesapkin es hakanim, and both the sharecropper as well as the owner have a responsibility to provide the poles. Okay, Rashi says over here the new poles each and every year. Fine. So we'll go through all of this. So Tana, makom shnagol liktzar in rashay lakar in rashay liktzar. Ushneim ma'akvin ze al ze. So now the Gemara says, in a place like we said before, in a place where the common custom is liktzar, then it will say when the sharecropper would go ahead and harvest wheat, he'd use a sickle, therefore leaving some of the stubble in the ground. So therefore again, the landowner can't make him do akira, can't make him uproot it. Or lakar, or ultimately where the common custom is lakar, to pull out the stalks from the ground. And a rashay liktzar, so ultimately again the sharecropper doesn't have the right to use the sickle and to leave some of the stubble on the ground. Ushneim ma'akvin ze al ze. And I will say, remember again, wherever there is the prevailing minhag hamakom, either party could force the other to comply with local custom. So the Gemara gives examples of this. Liktzar, eino rashay lakar. So I will say again, remember where the custom is to go ahead and do ktsira, which is harvesting with a sickle. Right? Neither party could insist on uprooting. So the Gemara says, listen to this, because the owner could say, Hi Amar, ba'ina detisvali aroi. So remember again, so even if the sharecropper wants to go ahead and uproot it, the owner could say, no, I don't want you to uproot it. Why? I will say there's a benefit to leaving the bottom stalks in the ground. What's the benefit? They essentially act as fertilizer. Right? It essentially fertilizes the field. So the owner says, if the custom is to do ktsira, and the sharecropper wants to do akira, so again, the owner could say, I don't want you to do akira because I want the stalks there. V'hai amar lo matzina. So the Gemara says, v'hai amar lo matzina. Lakar eino rashay liktzar. So if the custom was ultimately, again, to go ahead and uproot it, neither one could go ahead and force the other liktzar. Hi Amar Ba'ina Detinakarai. Because the landowner could say, listen, I want you to do akira. Why? I want the soil to be clean. Right? I want the field to be clean. V'hai Amar Ba'ina Tivna. Right? And again, the other one would say, I want there to be fertilizer. Ushnei ma'akvin ze'al zeh. So bottom line is that halacha l'maisa, whatever the minhag hamakom is, so either party could compel the other to abide by minhag hamakom. So once you have that statement, why do you need that secondary statement? So why do I need that second statement? That both could be ma'akev on the other. So the Gemara says, Matam kamar. It's actually that second statement that's just explaining the first. Matam kamar. Matam liktzar ino rashay lakar. Lakar eno rashay liktzar. I will say, why is it that if the custom was liktzar to uproot it, to harvest, you can't force one to uproot it, and to uproot it, you can't force to harvest. Mishum D'Shnei Ma'akven Zelza. Because we'll say halacha l'maisa, either party has the ability to ma'akev one or the other. So we'll say again. So the Gemara really just going in an exhaustive discussion over here. But halacha l'maisa again, the result being the same. That halacha l'maisa, whatever the minhag hamakom is, either for akira uprooting it or for katsira for harvesting, both must comply. And if either tries to deviate, the other party has the ability to compel them to remain in adherence with minhag hamakom. Beautiful. Lachrosh acharav yachrosh. If the common custom, I will say, now this is actually interesting. So just to illustrate what this is I will say now, generally, when do you plow a field? You plow a field generally right before you're about to plant. So what the Gemara was pointing out over here is that sometimes people have the custom immediately after harvesting to plow the field. Now, interestingly enough, what was the chap of that? That itself represented a form of weeding. That's what it was. In other words, you cleaned after the harvest season, you cleaned the field. Again, you would still plow it again before planting season. But like this was like a cleaning of the field after the harvest season. So therefore the Gemara said, the Mishnah said, Lachrosh acharav yachrosh. If the minhag hamakom was that you lived in a place where they commonly plowed the field after the harvesting, then you should do that. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. Lo tzricha ba'asra de lo menachshi va'azal ihu v'nachish. So what's interesting? Now, what are we talking about of a case over here? So let's say again, I am the sharecropper. So I'm working the field. Now let's say in the locale in which we live, it's not common to weed the field, right? Weed the field. What did I do? Now I, of my own volition, went ahead and weeded the field. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? Amarle, hay dinechishta adaita de lo karibnale. So listen to this. I could say to Ruvain, listen, the whole reason I weeded the field was that halacha l'maisa, after the harvest season, I didn't want to have to plow it. That's why I did it. So therefore, again, I shouldn't have to plow it now. Kamash malon di'iboy le'lefirushele. So we'll say, to which the Gemara says, if that was my intention, that's very nice. But if I did not articulate that and get Ruvain's consent for that, then halacha l'maisa, it doesn't work, and I would still have to plow it even after the harvest season. Okay? Hakol k'minhag haMedina. Everything goes in accordance with the minhag haMedina, right? Local custom. Hakol asuyei mai. So we'll say, what does hakol come to include? So the Gemara says, la'asuy hadatan rabbanon. Makom shenagu lahaskir ilanos al gabe karka maskirin. Makom she'ein nagu lahaskir ein maskirin. So Rabbi said, this is actually an interesting case over. Look at Rashi. Shenagu lahaskir ilanos. Im sedei lavan she'yital ha'aris chelko beperas ha'ilon. Afapi she'ena torach bayan she'enan tzrichin la'avoda. Well, so listen to this interesting case. I rent a field from Ruvain. So I'm a farmer. I rent a field from Ruvain. We have a sharecropping arrangement and our resource. So I'm going to go ahead and give Ruvain 2/3 of the produce. I get 1/3 or whatever the percentage is. I'm assuming the sharecropper usually gets the higher yield. I get 2/3 and Ruvain gets 1/3. It happens to be that on this field are fruit trees. I will say now, it's interesting. The Gemara assumes over here that fruit trees in general do not really need upkeep. They just kind of do their own thing. So the Gemara says over here something very interesting, that when the Mishnah says, Hakol k'minhag haMedina, everything goes in accordance with community custom. Now, both said that statement itself seems to be redundant, seems to be somewhat obvious. So why is the Gemara saying it over here? So this is interesting. The Gemara says, come to include the following case. Makom shenagu lahaskir ilanos agabe karka maskirin. Makom she'enagu lahaskir ein maskirin. To include also the following case, that halacha l'maisa in a place where it was common to include fruit trees in a sharecropping arrangement, they're included. But if it wasn't common to include them, they're not included. So we'll say, so again, let me go back to this case. I go ahead and I rent a field from Ruvain. I'm an artist, I'm a sharecropper. So we have a 2/3, 1/3 arrangement, right? I keep 2/3 of the produce, Ruvain keeps 1/3. On the field are fruit trees. So we'll say, what's the shayla? Do I get 2/3 of the fruit trees or not? Right? Now again, am I working those trees? No, but they're on the field. So the Gemara says that's totally dependent on minhag haMedina. right? That totally depends ultimately again on what common custom is. So Allah Chalamaisa again, if common custom is that the farmer does, then great. If not, not. So the Gemara says, Makom shenagu lahaskir maskir pshita. So we'll say, I understand, isn't that obvious? In other words, what's the chiddush over here? What's the chiddush? So what's the very thing? Lo tzricha dekuli alma yav betilsa va'azal ihu v'yav be'reviyah. Shabbos says an interesting case. What's the case here? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Yavi betilsa, nosten karkos larisin amanashi yitlu hein chelik shlishi, varishne chalakim. We'll say, normally, watch this, a normal sharecropping arrangement, the Gemara says, was normally, again, that halacha l'maisa, the sharecropper takes 2/3, right, and the owner takes 1/3. That was a normal case. Va'azal ihu, v'yave berevisa. And what happened? What happened, I will say, in this case over here, the owner legislated that the sharecropper will take 3/4, and ultimately, again, he'll only take 1/4. So, Ma'adatain, what would you have thought? The Amar Le, Hai de Batsri Lecha, Adaita de Lo Yavina Lecha Be'ilanos. So, I will say, so ultimately, again, so what happened? So, I would have thought in this case, maybe the Balabayis would say like this: the reason I'm willing to take less produce is because I assumed you were not taking anything from the trees, right? So I was willing to give you essentially more of the wheat because you were not going to take any because you were not going to take from the fruit. To which the Gemara says, "Hay debatzi lecha adaita de lo yavina lecha bilanos kamash malon di ibai le lefirushile." So I will say, what do you see from here? In other words, you can't make assumptions. Essentially, I will say, see, even in a case where, let's say again, the landowner agreed to less wheat under the assumption that I'll take less wheat, but you sharecropper won't share in the trees. These side deals don't work. Now, again, the side deals do work. How could the side deals work? How could they work? If they're articulated. I was also saying, you can make whatever arrangement you want, but in the absence of an explicit arrangement, everything defaults back to minhag hamakom. So if minhag hamakom is that the sharecropper shares in the trees, then that's the minhag hamakom. And the fact that you had a cheshbon, so this is very interesting. In other words, even though in this case over here, the landowner is taking less produce, and we assume, well, why is landowner taking less produce? It must be because he's assuming that the sharecropper is not going to get from the fruit, so therefore landowner will get all the fruit, therefore he's willing to give more wheat to the sharecropper, even though circumstantially we could construct this whole thing. If it wasn't articulated, everything defaults back to minhag hamakom. And minhag hamakom therefore will say, if this is a place where sharecropper shares in the fruits of the trees, then halacha l'maisa, he makes out well, right? He'll get the fruits of the trees and a higher percentage of the wheat. Incredible. Makom shenagu lahamid lahaskir in maskirin. I'm sorry. Did I skip here? Good. Makom shenagu lahaskir shenagu shelo lahaskir in maskirin. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says as follows. So pshita. So we'll say, isn't this obvious? Lo tzricha dekuli alma makabli bereviyah. So we'll say, so ultimately again, this is quoting the Brisa, right? It's one of the Brisa. We'll say, same thing with the fruit trees. It's quoting the Brisa. This is just the reverse case. Lo tzricha, the Gemara says, dekuli alma makabli bereviyah va'azua v'kiblo tilsa. In general, again, I will say the way it worked was that sharecroppers normally got 3/4 and the landowner got 1/4. And this sharecropper decided to do a 2/3, 1/3 split, giving the balabayis a larger amount of produce. So ma'adatema amarle haydita faylecha daita diaves libi lanos. And the sharecropper could say again, the reason I was willing to give you more produce was why? So that I should get to share in the fruits of the trees. Kamash malon di baile leferushele. So we'll say it's the same case, just the reverse. Salach lamais again, these side deals don't work. In other words, even though the sharecropper again was saying essentially, hey, landowner, I gave you more wheat so that I should be able to go ahead and share in the fruits of the trees. If they explicitly made that agreement, that's fine. But in the absence of an explicit agreement, everything defaults back ultimately again to minhag hamakom. So we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, tremendous. Mazel tov on finishing the old parak. Mazel tov on beginning the new parak. And shkoyach, incredible.